will be, many of the bones of the skeletal system will be named and identified with respect to specific bone markings as we go through the division of the skeletal system. Now, the 206 bones are divided into an axial skeleton, which includes the head, the spine, and the thoracic cage, nothing else. The appendicular skeleton then is affixed to that axial skeleton. And there are two places that can kind of cause confusion. Up here at the top, we have what's called the pectoral girdle, the pectoral appendicular skeleton. And it's attached by a collarbone, the clavicle, and a scapula, which is around on the back. Because it sits right here, high on the shoulders at the top of the chest, if I point to this and say, is this axial or appendicular skeleton, it's natural to say, oh, it's an axial skeleton, it's right there on the trunk. But it's not. The clavicle and the scapula are both part of the pectoral skeleton. They start that part of the appendicular skeleton. Likewise, down at the base of the spine, we attach the pelvis, which is two bones called coxal bones, that together with the sacrum, which is part of the axial skeleton, they form a rim called the pelvis. They are joined together by fibrous connections at the pubis region, and they form a kind of a bowl. That bowl attaches the legs on the lateral side and holds the weight of the abdominal cavity and pelvis organs on the superior side. That pelvis begins the pelvic appendicular skeleton, and the pelvic bones themselves, the coxal bones, are not a part of the axial skeleton. They are part of the appendicular skeleton. So let's take the same approach. Now I want to, as the text and as the lab book, and go through this axial appendicular, figuring out the bones, names, and positions, and something about how they are attached to one another before we actually try to form joints and move the skeleton. So in order to do that, I want to kind of repeat that excuse me a minute. I'm not seeing all of my There we go. Now I should be presenting entire screen. The axial skeleton, like everything else in science, is going to be arranged in hierarchies, categories that hold a number of elements, and each of those elements may have subdivisions. So in order to understand the axial skeleton, we first have to name what is there. The skull actually contains 29 bones. Now that may seem unusual, since the skull only has one bone that naturally falls off of it when you remove the soft tissue, and that's the jawbone. All the other 28 bones, no, that's not true. The jawbone falls off. The hyoid is also not attached to other bones, but everything else, those bones are attached and have very limited movement. The skull sits on top of the spinal column, which has 26 bones. That sounds like a lot till you realize that every one of them is a vertebra. And so as a result, there's a repetition in the naming of the bones and kind of a variation in their size. Finally, we have the thoracic cage that produces this large, protective, kind of picket fence arrangement of bones that allows for protection of the thorax with the heart, the lungs, the big vessels, tubes like the trachea, tubes like the esophagus. All of that is located right here in the thorax. Moving elements and delicate elements that need that protection. But of the 25 bones, we're going to find 24 of them are ribs. So the name identification is not going to be very difficult. We will use figures from the text from every angle. And the models in lab and the repetition from lab study is really the best source of learning for this. I know that I learn a great deal more when I look at the lab models. We have limited access to those lab models this year, but I know that Kenny Wilson will be planning an extensive review of bone names and bone markings. And I'm going to basically repeat that approach, and going over it twice, I'm hoping will help make you more familiar with the content of this Chapter 7, the axial skeleton. Now here we have the entire skeleton shown in the figure with the colored bones, this blue and yellow portion identifying the axial skeleton. Here is the skull. We're going to break down the skull to a cranium and a face and a number of smaller bones that are accessory. The 6 auditory ossicles, which are a part of our hearing special sense, and below the chin, the hyoid bone. And that in total gives you 29 bones in the skull area. I want to say this, that the majority of these bones grow independently at their edges. So there are cartilage connections. The mandible grows by interosseous, intermembranous ossification. And the mandibular joint, this one right here, is the only truly movable joint, bone on bone. That jaw action that's present in the skull. Everything else, when it reaches its mature size, the edges of the bones grow together. And that bone-on-bone interface, where they interdigitate, kind of like my fingers, is laced together with strong collagen fibers. That joint is called a suture, and when your skull is mature, there isn't actually bone material between the edges, it's collagen fibers. But that's so strong that it holds this skull together indefinitely. In looking at mummies, looking at grave goods, basically the remains of persons who have been buried a long time, sometimes thousands of years, the skull comes out intact if it has not been crushed. Now, the spinal column consists of vertebra from the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx region. These are all vertebra, and they are all going to produce the second most protected region of the body, the vertebral column. It encloses the spinal cord, which is essentially our wiring, connecting all the capacities of our brain with all the nervous capacities of the peripheral skeleton. So sensory messages coming in from the hands, motor commands going out to the leg muscles to walk, are all transmitted through the spinal cord in this vertebral column. Finally, this thoracic cage consists of 24 ribs and 1 sternum. And first thing I want to point out about where you have repeated names like ribs. If I ask you to identify the rib that is under the pointer right now, you can count down from the top, and it's the 4th one down. So people often identify it as the number 4 rib. I want you to actually see the skeleton. We don't have 12 ribs, we have 12 pairs of ribs. And so to identify where the pointer is now, you would say this is the number 4 right rib. Now the blue structures, shown as pads between the vertebra, those are intervertebral discs and those are cartilage. And these blue connections in the front, you can see span the distance between where the bone ends on the end of the rib and the bone begins on the sternum, the breastbone. So these are cartilage connections that allow this protective cage, called the thoracic cage, to be flexible. And the reason that's important is our primary limit to physical performance, to exertion, is oxygen supply. Now, we usually move oxygen at rest with our diaphragm. That's more than adequate to keep us oxygenated when we're resting. When we use our muscles, we burn so much more ATP. Our heart accelerates, our breathing accelerates to its maximum level. And at that point, these ribs actually lift like this, producing a huge increase in volume and drawing in much more air. And then they depress, they're pulled in the opposite direction by a complementary set of muscles and force that air out quickly so we can draw another breath. Now, all of this is part of that. We can generally produce cardiac output and muscular output that is 0.5, certainly 3 to 5 times our at-rest exchange capacity. So let's take a look. Let's use these hierarchies. The skull is something that's easier if you hold it in your hand. We can't quite do that, but we can pull it apart and show the 8 bones of the cranium. That's the brain case, the most protected part of the body. We basically have a hard, bony outer wall and a cavity within that completely encloses the delicate brain. Hanging in this notch, I like to think of it, the cranium, as an oval with a notch in it. You see that notch? And it consists of 8 bones. At maturity, we have 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, this one is the left, 2 temporal bones, this one is the left, and the occipital bone, so 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 6 bones. And then this notch is formed by the sphenoid bone shown here in purple, which forms kind of the back wall of the notch, and the ethmoid bone, which forms the roof of the notch. Now we're going to hang this face in that notch. 8 cranial bones. The face consists of 14 bones, and 12 of them consist of 6 paired bones and 2 individual bones. What we can see here are the more dramatic ones. The mandible is a single bone, and the vomer is a single bone. But these bones that are showing some of the others, there are paired zygomatic bones, maxilla bones, nasal bones, and lacrimal bones. The other 2 pairs are kind of more difficult to find. They're called the inferior nasal concha, left and right, and the palatine bones. It's a difficult thing to connect these bones to this face, and that is done by these squiggly lines called sutures. All over the skull we find these sutures. They form immovable joints at maturity, and the idea is to produce a rigid structure that's protective and not one that moves around. To look at the skull, this color coding of the figures is tremendously helpful if you have to try to distinguish those borders from those old plastic models. It's somewhat more difficult. This is really the place you see the rather irregular shape of many of these bones. The outer bones, the occipital, the temporals, the parietals, the frontal, are sort of flat bones that are curved around. But these internal bones that you can see here from the base are often very irregular. Look at this temporal bone shown in red, and all the processes attaching with sutures to surrounding bones. Every one of these features has a meaning, so that if it's a spine like this styloid process, the direction of that styloid process kind of tells you where the muscle attachment is going to go. It's going to go right down here to the basically the tooth and mouth oral region. We also see the presence of bone markings that are openings. For the nervous system to function correctly, there have to be ways that nerve connections can get out of the skull. Here's the main one, the foramen magnum, a marking of the occipital bone. From the bottom, you definitely can see as the single large hole that the spinal cord descends from. And on either side, the occipital condyles which you can see left and right. This is those bone markings in that table we looked at in Chapter 6. So a condyle is an occipital surface. Do you see how it's colored differently? It's very smooth to the touch. You don't put bumps and you don't put serrations on articular surfaces. They should be surfaces that are going to glide past one another. Here we have the occipital, the temporal. Around here in the front, you can just barely see the forehead sticking out in front. But from the bottom, we see all of these bones, which are the lower part of the face, and this is the sphenoid bone, which forms that back wall of the notch, and this is the tail of the ethmoid bone forming its roof. Here you can see the position of the palatine bone, left and right, and the vomer, a single bone that sits on the midline. These different figures I include because they really reveal the inner structure in a way that working with the solid skull cannot do. So we see here the extent of the frontal bone. We're accustomed to that being the crown of the forehead and the forehead, which is easiest to see. But we often do not include this upper platform inside the cranial cavity. There are actually three layers. This frontal cavity, then a mid-level where the floor created by the sphenoid bone is kind of right down here, and then we drop down to the third level of the occipital bone, which holds the cerebellum and completes the cranial cavity. The parietal bone is a great big flat bone. Since this is a midline cut, you can see the extent that it occupies. And on the far wall, the temporal, where the exposure outside and the various markings are very important to the basic functioning. There are many foramen and crests and lines that allow nerves to pass through this bone, and many attachments that are going to either attach ligaments for bone-to-bone connection, like the mandible, or attach tendons for muscle-to-bone connection. This figure reiterates what I said about the skull. You see how this would be a nice oval if it were completed, but there's this notch right here. The ethmoid bone is the main bone forming the roof of that notch, and it extends between the frontal bone and back to the sphenoid bone that forms the back wall. Now, the sphenoid bone is very central, connected to about every one of the surrounding bones, and even those bones of the face. Here in this notch, you notice that the ethmoid bone forms this roof, but there's also a perpendicular plate sticking down. This is forming the upper part of the septum of the nasal cavity, dividing it into two nostrils. With this ethmoid perpendicular plate in place, what we're doing is this side where the pointer is the left nostril, the right nostril is behind that plate. But it's only the upper half of that plate, the septum, that is formed by the ethmoid. The lower part is this single bone called the vomer. It stands on top of the maxilla at the midline, grows up and attaches a suture to the ethmoid, forming that complete bony septum. Now, the perpendicular plate and the vomer are not very thick front to back, but they are strong in their length and width dimension. Now, we're accustomed to this. There's certain things we just immediately know. For example, a piece of paper. Take a piece of copy paper and go like this, and you can rip it right in two. If you start the tear, if you work across the thin dimension, there's just not enough strength in those few fibers and the glues that hold them together to resist that tearing, if you move it in this direction. But if you take that same piece of copy paper and hold it lengthwise and try to pull it apart, there's enough friction between those fibers, very, very difficult to actually break that sheet of paper lengthwise or widthwise without tearing. So the same thing applies here. This perpendicular plate is going to be strong on stresses that are running along the midline, either perpendicular, either vertical or horizontal. This is in the middle of the skull. So basically, forces or contact that is moving left to right is just not experienced. So we see here the only movable bone on the whole skull, the mandible. It goes up and down quite actively, and it is involved in our breathing. It is involved in our articulation of our speech. It's involved in our eating. So that mobility is one that's very important to the way we use the skull. This is another section. Notice this particular horizontal section, a transverse cut into the nasal cavity. This orange bone shown here is the mandible, the maxilla, the upper border of the oral cavity and the lower border of the nasal cavity. We're looking at the nasal cavity right here. So the maxilla forms the palatine process, the hard palate, and in the back it joins with that the fifth bone that's paired, the palatine bone. This is the right palatine, showing the extent of the hard palate. Now if you take your tongue, run it back the roof of your mouth, you'll notice it feels bony, it feels hard, and then way at the back you drop off into soft tissue. That's this back border as you drop off of the, drop off the hard bony protection. There's actually soft tissue up above. Another feature of this maxillary bone is the presence of a sinus. Now a sinus is basically a chamber within the bone connected by airways to other openings. It allows vibrations to be damped out so that they don't enter the bone and vibrate them and cause them damage. We see the orientation of this maxillary sinus, a basic big part of that upper structure here, right below the eye, forming is a major sinus. The intricacy of the skull is probably shown best by looking right into the eye cavity or orbit. This orbit shows the joining of 7 different bones. Now, if we were going to make a cavity for something as important as the eye, we were manufacturing it, we would basically pour it into a mold. We would make this a single piece. Or we would take, if we were making it out of something like wood that's soft, we would bore it into a single piece to make sure we have retained the greatest structural integrity. But that's not the way a body grows. This body grows one cell at a time, and so these bones grow out and form these connecting sutures. And these connecting sutures are welding together all of the different bones that contribute to the orbital cavity. Now, if you look at the skull, the model, what you're going to see in here is basically a uniform white, very, very smooth cavity. These grow together not with edges or rough parts, but very, very smooth, supportive bone structure. But if we look, here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different bones that contribute to this orbital cavity, growing together in what appears to be a rather irregular way. Every one of those squiggly lines is a joint. It is immovable at maturity. And that joint is called a suture, laced together by strong collagen fibers. Now we see bones of the face in this. We also can see cranial bones. Here's the frontal bone. Out here we see the parietal and the temporal bone, bones of the cranium. The purple, we see here different exposures of the sphenoid bone, its job forming that back wall of that notch. And the green ethmoid bone is seen here within the orbital cavity, and it's extending downward in the septum, helping form the upper part of the septum of the nasal cavity. So the bones that we see here, and I kind of like this approach, how do you get a handle on all of those bones? I know that when I started practicing, and I had a kind of a vague recollection of the bone names, I just started using my body. So name the bones of the cranium, and I would go frontal, parietals, temporals, occipitals, and then I would go back wall sphenoid, roof ethmoid, to indicate how the notches form. That's the 8 bones of the cranium, because the parietals and temporals are doubled. When I do the face, that's 14 bones. That's a long list to remember, so I need some kind of system. So the way I start is with the paired bones, and I start right here and go across to the cheekbone. And the paired bones are the nasal bone, the upper part of the maxilla, the lacrimal bone, and the zygomatic bone. That's 2, 4, 6, 8. I just did my left side. There are 4 more on the right side. Now we have to kind of search for, I have to look at what slide I have. We have to search for the other paired bones. And for that, we look into the nasal cavity. Instead of looking in from the front, we're going to do a midline section. This is that ethmoid bone up above, and the sphenoid bone back here forming the back of that notch. And here are those 2 other paired bones of the face. This bone, shown in a kind of a blue color, is called the inferior nasal concha. A concha is a spiral. Conch shells have a spiral formation as the animal inside them grow. So the concha form a spiral or a bump on the outer wall of the nasal cavity. There's actually 3, but the upper and middle nasal concha are bone markings, as you can see up on the green ethmoid bone. Here's the perpendicular plate sticking down. It's been partially cut away. And below it, the inferior nasal concha, left and right. That's 9 and 10. In the back, here's that palatine bone we saw from another section, forming a rim around the bony exit from the nasal cavity. So the airway actually comes here and then drops in to a soft tissue cavity that we call the pharynx. We will see that the upper part's called the nasopharynx. It's at the back of the nasal cavity. At the back of the oral cavity, the oropharynx, and further down, there is a structure that separates flow in the airway from flow into the digestive tract. And that will be called the laryngopharynx. We'll return to that in a bit. So here we have those 12 bones, 1, 2, basically nasal, lacrimal, maxilla, and zygomatic, inferior nasal concha, and in back of them the palatine bones. That's 12 bones. The 2 remaining bones are the mandible and the vomer. The vomer will stand here on the palatine and extend up about this far. The perpendicular plate of the ethmoid will stick down and join to it to form the septum. And the mandible, of course, is one of the more visible bones because it's the one that moves right there on the front and the side of the face, moving up and down. Now, these kinds of soft tissue preservations, this is the bony structure with the soft tissue in place, showing you that when you add the soft tissue to the bone, very much changes the appearance. What we're looking at here are sinuses So, for example, we talked about the maxillary sinus here and here. Look how large they are in extent. Up here is a sinus in the frontal bone, the frontal sinus. This is the top of the airway with the ethmoid coming down to here. And here is the superior and middle nasal concha that are formed on bone markings on the ethmoid. Below, the vomer stands on top of the palatine process of the maxilla and sticks up and joins to it. See that lump? And on either side, the bones we call the inferior nasal concha. See how they form a kind of a spiral? And they reduce this huge nasal cavity to basically a maze of very thin, very convoluted cavities. So we breathe through our nose, the air comes in this direction. We're going to shove it over bumps and around corners, causing that air to hit wall and change direction. We're basically going to create turbulence in the air. And the reason for this labyrinth, this maze of tiny, convoluted passageways, is to do three things with the air. By hitting the air against a lot of wall surface, we're going to, number one, warm it, number two, humidify it, and number three, remove dust or smoke or molecular toxins. They're going to stick to the mucus, and basically the mucus is going to move out, carrying with it. It's essential that we condition the air before it reaches the delicate tissue of our lungs. And that's the reason for this bony structure in the nasal cavity. We can see the presence of the orbital cavity. Now, this wasn't exactly a symmetrical cut. We got deeper into the right eye than we did into the left. But you can see the back of the orbital cavity here, and you can see more of a central cut in the eye tissues that are present here. Now, down below, look at the extent of the oral cavity created by that maxilla, basically, and the mandible below, but filled with, look at that massive tongue. What a big tissue. The only thing we actually do with the tongue is look at the surface. But in fact, it's a muscular, and it's both strong, and its surface is resistant to abrasion. Food is the hardest material we put in our body routinely, and it's going to scrape cells away. So those cells on the surface are going to be tough, and they're going to be fast growing. But we also use the tongue in its most flexible and rapid movements to articulate our sounds and make them into speech. So the point is this, that is the structure that you could see here. These cranial bones would form this outer rim down to about here. Here the mandible would form the lower margin, and the soft tissues reveal that every shape and every structure has a meaning. Now, as we move from the skull, there are a couple of bones we've left out. There are 3 auditory ossicles inside each ear, called the malleus, incus, and stapes, left and right. They essentially are going to transfer the energy that comes in through those sound waves, compressing and rarefying waves in the air, and transfer that to the tympanic membrane. The auditory ossicles are between the eardrum and the hearing organ, called the cochlea. So there are 6 more bones in the ear canals. And finally, right down here below the chin, in fact, kind of right behind this region, there's this region. You can see where the chin comes straight back and then forms an angle as it comes down. This angle is held in place by the only bone in the body that does not articulate with another bone. It's called the hyoid. It's a U-shaped bone, and it also clasps around the airway and provides structure and anchoring for the larynx. So that completes naming the bones of the face, and I'm sure your lab will ask you to go over these bones and bone markings more extensively. The spinal column, or the vertebral column, consists all vertebra, and they alter in their size and their connection as they go from top to bottom. Up here at the top, all you're supporting is the head. But the spinal column provides a strong column of bony support. Let's reiterate that. Bone is by far the strongest tissue in the body. It is where we want to hang the weight. So what do we mean by good posture? Good posture is aligning the skeleton so the weight is on the bone. If you hold your skeleton in such a way that the weight is on the muscles, you quickly get fatigue or even breakdown. When we are born, there are two primary curves, which mean genes make this portion of the vertebral column curved. And that's the primary curve is the thoracic curve, shown here, from T1 down to T12. And on the far end, the sacral curve. Now, these were once 5 vertebrae that were free. They're now fused. And they basically, this is a primary curve, genetically determined. But the lumbar regions and the cervical region are straight up and down. Now, the way this spine develops into a double recurved column. So here you notice a cervical curve, a thoracic curve, a lumbar curve, and a sacral curve, always alternating in the bulge, the direction of the bulge. What happens is that one of the first things the baby learns to do is hold its head up. When it starts holding its head up, the weight of the head presses down on the cervical vertebra and develops this secondary curve with the bulge slightly forward. As the baby learns to roll over, as it learns to sit up, and then learns to stand, the weight of the body comes down on this lumbar region and produces another forward bulging secondary curve, the lumbar curve. The vertebrae are divided into regions: 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. Now, these regions are like meal times: 7 o'clock breakfast, 12 o'clock lunch, and 5 o'clock supper. And then below, the single sacrum, which is a fused bone that was at one time 5 independent vertebrae, and below it, the coccyx, the remnant of our tails. The way the vertebrae are attached is very complex because you're going to encase the spinal cord with hard, bony protection. That hard, bony protection is going to have to be done in such a way that the spine remains flexible so we can bend and stretch and produce all the flexibility that's necessary to make maximum use of our body. So the first thing we're going to do is take these vertebrae, 3 are shown here, probably from a lumbar region, and we're going to stack them so that this anterior marking, this round columnar thing called the body, sits on top of and directly above the body of the vertebra below. But we're not going to stack bone on bone directly. On the anterior place, we're going to insert this intervertebral disc. The disc is a fibrocartilage pad, and I think that studying intervertebral discs is what gave the idea for gel pads in running shoes. It allows for an adjustment of the position. It allows for a compression. So if you lean your body in this direction, it will produce basically a tilt to the vertebra, and this disc will get thinner on this side and wider on this side, but still support the connection of these two vertebrae. Now here on the reason we do this from the posterior side is back here, each vertebra has two bumps that stick down. These are the inferior articulating processes, and two bumps that stick up. These are the superior articulating processes, and the blue shows where the cartilage connections are. So this vertebra in the center illustrates it best. Its superior processes articulate face to face with the inferior processes of the vertebra above, and going back to the middle, the inferior processes articulate face to face with the superior processes from below. So you can see this vertebra is mounted with a kind of a 5-point stance. Intervertebral discs separate the body and cushion them, and these inferior and superior connections produce a kind of a triangle of support that allows for twisting and rocking back and forth. Now, what we've just done is covered the main part of, excuse me a moment. We've covered the main part of the first half, basically, the majority of the axial skeleton. So I'm going to end the axial skeleton right here. We'll pick this up again on Wednesday. And this recording will be available as soon as I can get it up